All right, it's time. Let's do it. Let's chat Babel, or The Necessity of Violence and Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution by R.F. Kuang. This has been a highly anticipated release, so I am not pretending like I am the first person to talk about this book. Not that that distinction matters either, but I haven't been following the conversation around this super closely because I already was anticipating it and I wanted to go in with fresh eyes. But if you have been following the conversation and this book and still find yourself here, highly appreciated. It is a little odd, or maybe not, to be sitting down to talk about this book on the day that Queen Elizabeth II died. Because while this book does not deal directly with the monarchy, it does obviously, or will become obvious if not already, explore institutions, interrogate institutions of colonialism. So yeah, let's explore some of that how. And again, as usual, at least at this time of year, not sure if it's going to come through on your end, but the cicadas are very loud right now. So while I haven't been reading fantasy as voraciously as I used to, or as I ideally want to, as I've said before, I'm not reading as voraciously in any genre as I ideally want to. Regardless of that, Kuang and the Poppy War trilogy is one of the best fantasies I've personally discovered as a reader within the last decade or so, and I know that I'm not alone in that assessment. It is a highly acclaimed series for a reason, and many of the things about that series were surprising for me as a reader to find myself drawn to, and that I was initially drawn to that first book for the idea of the school setting, and that series really explores the trauma of war, the bonds of war, colonialism, and the violence of colonialism in a very specific way, but it's much more a war narrative than I generally find myself drawn to, and it is very violent. It is very violent. This is also very violent, but it also explores different grades of violence and different kinds of violence, and I think that it's very powerful in that exploration as well. So while most of this narrative still takes place within a school setting as the first Poppy War book did, it's a much different kind of setting, especially within the Poppy War. It was more of a military academy, but there are still these seeds of things that feel like echoes or ghosts kind of lingering around that are familiar and comforting narratively that remind me of the Poppy War. And comforting feels odd to say because there is nothing comforting about this narrative while also being so incredibly engaging. Kuang's voice continues to be incredibly strong, even as it's doing much different things here, and I think that this book is really cementing her as a giant in the genre. Additionally with this, before we really dive in, I'm going to try to avoid certain spoilers, but I'm not going to be able to avoid all, especially because so much of this feels shaped around inevitability, especially in relation to its setting, this idea of Babel and the Tower of Babel, and the ways colonialism is being explored here, and some of the patterns of behavior that are observable through that lens. And that is where I might get the most spoilery, because it doesn't, to me, feel like a spoiler in all ways, because I was not surprised by some of those turns, and I do not think I was supposed to be. And I'm directly referring to things regarding white feminism here. So even as the voice of this can feel a little academic, and it's supposed to feel a little academic, we are still pulled in from the first with this emotion, this violence, and this act of loss. So we are introduced to Robin, our protagonist, as he is basically dying of a cholera outbreak. He has lost his family, he has lost his mother, and out of this, Professor Lovell appears and rescues Robin and spirits him away. But this act of rescue is not completely altruistic. First, he kind of gauges Robin's skill by putting him to a test with a metal bar that we later find out is related to the magic system of this world, and this magic system that is connected to the Industrial Revolution type setting that we are placing the main action of the novel amidst. And so as readers, we immediately get some sense that he is assessing Robin against what he can get from Robin, or what Robin has an aptitude for. There is some reason he is rescuing Robin in particular. And some of that you can probably assume, and Robin will later kind of assume about what some of his motivations or connections to Robin are. But he also immediately strips Robin of his Chinese name. And as readers, we are not given that name. He is the boy before he is Robin. And Robin Swift is a name that he picks out from the kind of adventure stories that he has read. That also means that from the first page as readers, we are confronted with racism and the violence of racism and the way that language is used to forward racism, which is part of the whole crux of this book. And so Robin is then taken to England by this professor, and he is raised in isolation studying Latin and Greek with the understanding that he will matriculate to Oxford when he comes of age, and he will become a translator at Oxford, which is a highly respected and prestigious position because it is directly related to silverworking, which is the magic system of this world, but is also the way that we are kind of forwarding England into the future. It's very much positioned as a means of industrialization and part of the Industrial Revolution, and it's also shown as a tool of colonialism. But this offers Robin protection, and then when he goes to Oxford, he finds a home in a way that he has never known, specifically through the people that he meets too, his cohort, especially Rami, who is the first friend that he makes. And it talks about that instantaneous kind of bond and friendship and relationship there between the two of them, especially as they're able to bond over the way they are treated as outsiders, because Robin is Chinese and Rami is Indian. And then they meet the other half of their cohort, who are both women, Victoire, who is a Black woman that was born in Haiti and raised in France, and Letty, who is kind of described as a quintessential English rose. And so they are all coming from very different backgrounds, and they stand out against the white male Oxford environment. However, their position at Babel and with the Translator Society really offers them a lot of privilege, first to even be at Oxford in the first place, and they are given an allowance and taken care of in a lot of ways. And so we kind of get to see the difference between how they're treated within the tower and this idea of the ivory tower and this kind of romanticization of the life of the mind, and then seeing how they are treated differently by the larger world of Oxford and kind of these young men that are just going for the connections and to be at Oxford. And I am by no means an Oxford scholar. And so this book has really been positioned as dark academia, and I am not as familiar with that subgenre as I would like to be. I've definitely read titles, but I need to dive further into that for sure. But to me, this is a very nuanced, complex, and searing indictment of academia from someone who is clearly within it and loves it to some degree. It's very interesting because we are clearly enmeshed in this world. We get a sense of the studies and what all of these students are pursuing and how passionate they are about their languages and what opportunities this affords to them, not only in elevating their potential for their futures, but also just being able to pursue avenues of study that they're interested in. However, the tone of the book also keeps us a little bit distant from that, even as this is an atmosphere that it would be easy to romanticize, and we have surely romanticized in the past, and we are watching these characters kind of fall in love with this place as it offers them a freedom that they have never known. We also still get the idea that in many ways these characters are still trapped. There is still the claustrophobia there, especially as we're mostly seeing them in these kind of tight spaces. And I feel like the narrative does a really good job at painting the tower as kind of a tight, enclosed space. And also it never fully enwraps us in romanticizing academia. We are seeing a lot of this through our characters, particularly Robin's eyes, and it almost feels like montages. And part of this is from the outset. The minute Robin sets foot on campus, he almost immediately becomes enmeshed in this kind of revolutionary society, the Hermes Society. And this is an underground revolutionary group directly opposing the translators and the colonialism they are forwarding through silverworking. And the way that language is treated here is fascinating. We get a little bit of the vampiric nature of academia because we see the power of language for these scholars and the way they are mining language kind of directly correlates with the acts of colonialization and the mining of resources in other areas, because they are stripping these languages of everything they can while looking down on the people of these countries that the language comes from. And the narrative shows the ability of these academics to kind of turn it off and on. They are enmeshed in the study of language, the power of language. They have seen how it can literally shape the world through the use of silverworking. They are following really convoluted etymologies, trying to discover new utilizations for words. And yet we also see them saying things like, it's only words, out and about in natural life. There is a real disconnect between the academic and reality. And I think it really forwards and highlights a lot of things we still see in academia, and how these systems perpetuate, and how we can feel so divorced of the world in these ivory towers, because it talks about how they are separate from the rest of the world in many ways. And we see the rest of the world start to encroach, specifically around revolutions related to industrialization and things like the Luddites. And this I found fascinating and so well done, because I will admit, we maybe studied the Luddites briefly in school. It's a word that I use in my vocabulary, and it's easy to kind of throw out. But when you really dig into, like this narrative does, it really forces us as readers to see what was going on, to see why people were unhappy, to show the political unrest. And it's easy, I think, to kind of sanitize these histories because we know the outcome, but it really shows the pressure cooker that was existing at this time, and how people were being turned against each other by those in power in ways that I think we are seeing still today. And yet you have these scholars that feel so removed from this, and in many ways are perpetuating this harm. They're creating this harm. That's why it starts to come to them, because these men are so angry that their jobs are being taken, their world is being changed, the rich keep getting richer. And then you have characters like Robin, who are directly contributing to the subjugation of their own country through this work, even as they are the safest they've ever been, and potentially the most personally fulfilled in other ways. And so it really explores that idea of the individual versus the collective, and what makes people see larger things and what makes them turn away, and on much different scales as well. And so throughout this, there is that kind of academic sense, but the way that Kuang juxtaposes it and balances it with doses of reality, moments of violence, it shocks us as readers out of that complacency and that intellectualism too. And it's clearly asking us to engage with it on an intellectual level as well, but it's never going to let us completely intellectualize it. It's going to force us as readers to really confront some of these ugly truths. And again, a lot of these ugly truths and betrayals feel inevitable, but there are also moments, twists, violence that are a shock. And things feel charged and dire. And we're watching these students go up against an empire. And they are being directly correlated by the narrative in a lot of ways with the Luddites, with these revolutionaries that we know didn't succeed. And so that is an idea here too, how to go against institutions, what sacrifices make a difference, what sacrifices are worth it, but also where is survival the greatest win. And so in some ways, with personal choices for our characters, we can see some of the mirrors of the Poppy War, because we are really driving our characters up against a wall in terms of difficult choices where there may not be a way out. And we are forcing them to confront major violence and make big decisions in terms of both the personal and larger empire implications. And it also asks us as readers to grapple with that, the idea of these institutions, the personal versus the political, and where the lines blur, where it's more than just personal satisfaction. There is, like I said, a searing indictment of white feminism that, as someone who took even one feminism class in college and has lived through the last 5 to 10 years, I was not surprised by. And even as this book is really digging at intellectual ideas, conceptual frameworks that are even being reflected in the style of the book, the writing, the structure, all of that, even amidst that, it is so incredibly personal. Robin struggles, watching him try and reconcile the comfort he has found in this place and these people, doing what he loves, surrounded by people he has come to love, even while he is being faced with the realities of what this place mean. And I do like too the way it showed revolution, because especially when Robin is first pulled in, he has one contact and he is separate from the larger picture of this thing. The Hermes society is so fragmented for its own protection that Robin doesn't have this connection to a larger ideological font, so to speak. So he is kind of stumbling through on his own. And at one point, the tower becomes more fortified and he sees a much bigger risk in what he is doing. And he says, I can't do this anymore. And he kind of squares off with his contact, who is a more important figure than that, but I won't spoil that. And it butts against this idea of what is choosing comfort and willful ignorance and causing harm, and what is just basic, bare bones survival. So this book isn't simple. It doesn't offer simple questions, and it doesn't offer simple answers and resolutions, even in its plotting. I really enjoyed that it took pieces that felt like they were going to be part of the culmination and the climax, things that felt like we were building to these large standoffs, and it took those and placed them earlier in the narrative in a way that kind of pulled the rug out from under me as a reader anyway, because then it made me really kind of contend with my need for that structural comfort and the way that this narrative wasn't going to be moving in the same way that I maybe hoped. I really had to reckon with the knowledge that as a reader, I wasn't going to get that tight little bow. I wasn't going to get that comfort. Even as I knew from the outset, based on the imagery, that that's probably where we were going to end up, my narrative brain didn't want to believe it. And so the end really pushed that. And in many ways, I would argue similar to the kind of structural end of the Poppy War series. Kuang is really good at pushing to the extremes of these moments right up against the edge, but she doesn't pretend that there's always going to be a safety net there to catch us. We have to contend with that free fall a little bit, both narratively and conceptually, with the greater ideas being explored. So while I did valiantly attempt to read this in a day, I am either no longer a one-day fantasy reader, or this book required a little bit more from me as a reader than a day allowed. But I really enjoyed it, which sounds odd to say about something that is so heavy, but it is so masterfully done. It offers so much to dig into, so much to think about, and the way that these ideas are framed both conceptually and intellectually within the text and within the plot and the action is just masterful. There are moments where some readers may find it a little didactic. However, taking into account the academic setting, I think it fits. We've got a lot of characters pontificating, and in many ways, this is part of their justifications within this world, either to themselves or to others. And it just fits within the feel of the book. So I obviously just barely grazed the surface of this one. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts about it. There is plenty to dig into, to be sure. So let me know what I missed that you want to talk about, or what I did talk about that you want to tease out further. But either way, thanks for hanging out. Read something good, and yeah,